tear himself away from his delicious granola snack. So, first question for Colleen. Do we have enough time to avert ecological collapse and social upheaval on an unparalleled scale if we follow a reformist path to transformation? Just a small question.
Well, a simple answer in the interest of time, no. I mean, but I think we need to take that seriously. And I think that's a serious one that has some immediate consequences. You know, a lot of us have heard about the Green New Deal, and I'm sure there's many people around who are kind of cheering it on. But I think we need to look at it very critically and interrogate it for the faults that it has. And it has many, and it's the way it's being framed right now, let's be honest. It's a deal that's about sustaining capitalism and coming up with a green type of capitalism. That ain't gonna cut it. So, you know, from my vantage point, initiatives like that, I think we should applaud that it's addressing the issue, but challenge it to go deeper and to deal with what we concretely need, not just what people think is acceptable, but in the kind of current political framework and arrangement that exists. Because that's collapsing, and it's collapsing fast, and if we don't have something prepared, you know, thinking ahead, that's going to address the real concrete needs, not only of our species, but of complex life on this planet, then we're going to be in serious trouble. Because it's not just how do we sustain all of this in a greener way. We're dealing with the sixth, you know, great extinction right now. And we have to play a very conscious and deliberate role of intervening, which means changing our own behavior first and foremost on a systemic level. So reform is not going to get us there. We got to go a lot deeper and a lot faster and a lot more critical. And so to the extent that we're engaging folks who are trying to bring up these conversations, we can't let them off the hook. Even though they're more on our side of the equation than not, we can't let them off the hook and saying, well, just because you mentioned something green makes it worthwhile for us to pursue. We got to go a lot deeper and get down to the fundamental nitty-gritty of we have to create another type of civilization based not in extractive logic, not in exploitative logic, but based on serving the broad needs of all the species that are involved in this. And that's going to require us to go deeper into the knowledge bank than just relying on Western science that gets us to a certain point, but not deep enough. Because it can, you know, what Western science can tell you is about what we're doing wrong and why and to quantify it. It doesn't tell you how to necessarily be in right relationship with nature, though. That requires, you know, relying upon traditional senses of knowledge that all of us come from in different points of time in history that we have to kind of, you know, draw upon, but not in the sense of like you're going back. And, you know, I'm not going back to 16th century Africa. That's not going to happen, right? But there are things I can learn from how folks lived in that time that can be brought forward today to put me in right relationship with the things around me. So that is what I want to offer, you know, just briefly and humbly.
Would anyone else like to respond?
I agree.
All right, we'll move on to Kali's second question then. How can the solidarity economy lead to a post-capitalist, post-fossil fuel future?
Much more complex question, actually. And why do I say that? Because I think there's a challenge that we have to have in thinking that we're going to kind of replicate what exists just in some more equitable way. Like having a lot of this is going to require an extensive system of extraction, which is not sustainable. So there's new ways in which we're going to have to learn how to actually live with each other that this system has not engendered at all. And that is where I think it's in those, you know, more subjective and interpersonal aspects of building solidarity and really trying to define what that means. You know, what does mutualism mean? What does non-exploitation really mean in terms of our direct interaction with each other and with broader communities. Like, that's where I think some of the strength of the solidarity economy really has some things to offer, I think, towards really envisioning what a new society has to look like to a certain extent. Now, there's going to be flexibility. There has to be, for different space, time, and conditions. But I think it's in those type of interactions that we really need to look deeper in, and not just in, even though we're experimenting with like new technology and we're very proud of that, but it's not so, that's not going to replace human beings dealing with each other. If anything, we're trying to invest in certain types of new technologies to enable us to be more human, to relate to each other better, right? Not to eliminate the need for us to interact with each other. And if we look at a lot of the technology the way it is now, like the cell phone, great invention, but in many respects, I think we would all agree, it actually inhibits social interaction when most people are walking around like this, looking at their cell phone and not paying attention, I'm sure on college campus, not paying attention or engaging in the people who are sitting directly around you, right? So in that regard, it's an antisocial tool, right? When what we need are more social tools so that we understand each other, understand what we're going through, and try to figure out, well, how do we deal with the system collectively as opposed to just kind of suffering in silence or suffering in some ether world, waiting for somebody to respond when the person right next to you might actually be of some help and some service.
Yeah, I completely agree. Solidarity economy is also about the transformation of the economy, but I suppose the economy really on a much broader level, right? And it includes not only our social and political system, but also us as human beings. And so to the extent that we shed a system of capitalism that is constantly trying to make us better consumers, because if we're better consumers, they can sell their stuff, and if they can sell their stuff, they can make more money. That's a dynamic. That's the treadmill, and all that science about advertising is super scary. It's really scary. But if we had a system that wasn't based on having to sell in order to make money, I mean, that would be helpful. And then also as Kali said, right, as we elevate, as we emphasize our connections with each other, we're also recognizing that that's so much more important than stuff, right? And so we can accumulate less, hopefully, have more simple lives, have more community production, have more self-production, share more rather than us all having to have our own this, that, or the other. And so, there are a lot of things about solidarity economy in terms of our relationships that can help. And one of the big issues is, do we have time?
I wanted to add one thing about when we talk about solidarity economy or our relationships as human beings, is that I don't want to only center human beings in that conversation. And I don't want this to only be about how we reconfigure and re-understand our systems that we live in as human beings, because we also need to remember that it is the salmon and the trees and the water and all of those things that deserve just as much solidarity as we do with each other. And we have to start thinking about them, because for indigenous peoples, especially in this region, as salmon people, there's a lot of our old stories that talk about how, and actually there's one tribe, the Wintu from Redding, the Redding area, where they talk about how in the beginning of the world, human beings didn't have a voice, and they were like the most kind of saddest little beings that existed, and they were like naked and didn't have any hair to keep them warm, and they were just like these sad little creatures, and they were worried, the other beings on this planet were worried about human beings, like what was going to happen to these sad little things. And Salmon said, we will give them our voice so that they can speak up, and then their job is to speak up for us, and we will take care of them. we'll feed them and nourish them, and their job is to make sure that we're okay. So from the very beginning, we have to remember that as much as we are fighting a Green New Deal for each other so that we can still breathe air, our salmon, our deer, our other, what in Indigenous studies we call more than human beings, need us to center them just as much as anything else.
I really didn't want to add anything. But I think the situation is so perilous, I mean, particularly around the environment, that we do have to think about how we're going to mobilize to get something done. You know, we have to think about that now. You know, and I was just reading an article the other day that talked about how our money is being spent by the government in terms of research and development. You know, do you know how much of our money is spent on, percentage-wise, research and development for anything to do with the environment, anything to do with, you know, advancing human beings and our relationship to both ourselves and nature? No, it's about 1%. You know how much is spent on the military and advancing war technology? It's 85% of our money is spent on military. Now, that's devastating, but just think if we could just force them to begin the process of investing our money. This is our money we're talking about. We're not talking about corporations here. We're talking about our money. You know, just to figure out how do we spend 50% on the future of the planet? You know, and I think that when you think about capitalism, you have to, I always think, look, these people must know that the future is not going to be here if we don't do something. Why don't they do something about it? Capitalism won't let them. Competition demands that they fight for an advance on their competitor. Fighting to save the future, which they think might be 50 years away, hell, we can do that later. You know, and so when I think about spending our money, and I say, well, why can't we just make them spend 50%? No, capitalism won't let them. We have to transform capitalism so that we can not spend 50%, but spend all the money necessary to secure our future. You know, and so even from the standpoint of the environment, which is a dire situation, capitalism refuses to allow, even if you want to spend the money necessary to treat this like the problem it is.
So that's the last question we have prepared up here, and in the interest of time, I think we're gonna go straight into some Q&A with audience members. And so if you have something that you'd like to ask one or more of the panelists, you can raise your hand, and I'm gonna be prioritizing women and people of color first, so. Eric?
Yeah, we were talking a little bit about the Green New Deal, right? And last year I ran on the Green New Deal. I ran on the Green Party's Green New Deal. And this current resolution, this non-binding resolution that was in Congress, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, when I looked through that, and I compared that to what the Green Party of the U.S. has been proposing about a decade ago now, I see there's about 25% of what we propose. And one of the biggest pieces is dismantling of the industrial military complex. We suggested at least a 50% cut of the military industrial complex, as well as shutting the door on green capitalism and directly investing into new energy not the way we wrote it originally, right? So, do you think there's a way forward now that the Democrats have killed that non-binding resolution, that we can get back to what, like Howie Hawkins, who's running for president now, to get back to an eco-socialist green new deal, one that actually pushes for dismantling of capitalism and the building of new structures in that neighborhood kind of effort? Do you think that's something worth? Is it just would that be reform too, or is that something that we should again push try to push more on the eco-socialist?
You want to take it on like one by one?
Yeah.
Is this microphone?
No, it's not working.
Oh, is it on?
It's working. This one's working. So I just got that one there.
Yeah, much better. Sorry about that. Is it reform? Even in the Green Party version, yes, it is. Is it worth fighting for? Yes, it is. Is there space for it? That depends on us. Honestly, that really depends on us. How well we are willing to organize and mobilize folks, that's a subjective question for us. I think what they've been able to do, clearly it's been a hijack because they done took a lot of stuff from everywhere, and some of the forces behind it, let's be honest, have intentionally diluted it. Not because they didn't know. They knew what they were cutting out, and they knew why they wanted to cut it out. But they've kind of created a narrative that they can't actually control. That's both good and bad. Because now you got, I think something in New York just passed a couple of weeks ago that they're calling a Green New Deal, which had nothing to do with what Ocasio-Cortez and Momentum and those folks, put forward. So it's kind of just a term that's out there now that almost really doesn't mean anything to a certain extent. Folks can kind of give it the meaning that they want. Well, hell, ain't nothing stopping us from re-articulating what the Green Party put out or something even more. That's an organizing question. In fact, that's an organizing question. So should we be pushing it? Like I was saying earlier, I think we should. I think they've created more of an opportunity to do a broad level of the dialogue and discussion with some forces, and rather than be mad at that, they're stepping to that void because they don't know what to do with the space that they created. In truth, right? Some of us have some ideas, but we have to put the organization in place to be able to actually move our ideas. So that there's some figuring out of what we need to do as well. So to me, I think that's a challenge back to all of us collectively, right? Like, how do we make that, part of a real concrete plan that we're going to institute, whether they pass anything in Washington or not. Like, that's ultimately where it really has to get down to the level of what are we going to do and what we're going to force them to do through the strength of our organizing.
So we'll take a few more questions, and just in recognition of the time, we hope you can stay a bit longer. I know we're running a little bit late, but before we lose too many of you, I do want to make a couple of quick announcements just about the rest of the conference. Make sure that you all know that we have a day full of workshops tomorrow from 9:30 to 5:30 over in Siemens Hall with registration in Goodwin Forum at Nelson Hall East. This is the detailed program, and you'll find these schedules posted around the area tomorrow, so we hope you can show up. And I also wanted to make sure people know Cooperation Humboldt is involved in a coalition of groups planning a Take Back May Day March and Festival. It's going to be on March 1st. Oh, sorry. May 1st. I just looked at the Courthouse Rally March and I said March. There was a reason. So, Courthouse Rally at noon, March at 1, Festival 1:30 to 9 with a bunch of music and stuff. So, find these if you're interested. So, do we have more questions? Oscar?
So, and this question is for everyone on the panel, not specific for anyone. I just want to acknowledge the diversity here of age as well as other characteristics. Specifically the age extend that dialogue and that conversation to the following generations, because as the previous speaker just mentioned, we are setting a path, and that path is something that we have to carry forward for generations to come. So, you know, when we think about conversation between our small nuclear families to our meso environment, we need to think about how it's going to continue with the coming generations. And so how do you guys think we can, not like, you know, obviously we need to implement media and, you know, apply mass media communication, because that's the day and age that we are right now. Well, what type of conversations would you endorse or want to, you know, mention to have to, you know, just your family or just your community or just your friends? How can we influence our social network within our own self to, you know, really move forward with the solidarity economy?
Sure. Well, so it's interesting because I would say, I'm from Massachusetts, and so we've been organizing some statewide convenings around solidarity economy, and there's a fairly good diversity, but my sense is younger people get very excited about it, like something hopeful, something concrete, something positive, something that's not necessarily about trying to pressure the government or some other actor, but some things that steps that people can take immediately. So my sense is it resonates a lot across generations. Some of the older generations are probably, you know, was harking back to their hippie roots, and so it resonates on that level. But for a lot of young people, my sense is it resonates a lot in a time where there's so much cynicism and hopelessness and frustration.
I have teenagers, and then a daughter that thinks she's a teenager, and they listen to whatever Instagram tells them to do. So I would say become an Instagram influencer, but that's one way. But I would say that what I've really discovered about my teenagers is they are very capable and very invested in conversations like this. But it's not very often that people will sit down and actually start to really talk to them about what a post-capitalist society looks like, what radical imagination is, what activism is, and yet they are very knowledgeable and aware of what's happening around the world. And the things that people their age are doing, the young people walking out for climate change, the young people posting like stats about what's happening in their communities, the people refusing to go to school on Fridays and going to speak in front of the UN matters to them. It's getting to them. I think what happens sometimes is we assume they're not wanting to have that conversation. But with my teenagers and their friends, and maybe this is just sort of like what I do, when they come into spaces and they start going like, oh, I love this new makeup line, or oh, I'm really into this new thing, I'm always like, let's talk about how that's based on this. Let's have real conversations. I think sometimes we treat even kids, I work with kids as young as 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade, like they can't have these conversations, but they can. And they're very interested and invested in what this world is gonna look like for them. And they believe in their kinship and relationship to everything, to the fish and the water and the tree. Like they believe it. If I'm saying to them, you know, you need to be nice to the fish because they provide things for you and you should say thank you, they'll go, thank you. They will do that without even questioning what that's for. So I think we have to start bringing them in a way that treats them as tiny little leaders and letting them speak and letting them talk and showing them that they have just as much power in that situation. I always tell people, I get up here, I do these talks, and you feel like I know something, like I'm real smart, because I'm sitting in front of you with like a microphone, and then they tell you like she went to Stanford, and they're like, that's a big deal. But I'm not any different than anybody else that can say these things. Everybody has a story to tell. We have to teach the young people how to tell their story and use their voice if they want to. So invite them into that conversation. In any space you're in, think about how you can invite the young people to come and talk, and they will talk, and they will speak to you. I want to say one more thing though, and tell them the truth. I think sometimes people try to tell kids something like a version of the truth because they're afraid it's going to give them nightmares or something. I don't know. Kids need to know the truth. Everybody's always asking me, how are we supposed to tell kids in the 4th grade about what happened to Native American people? How are you supposed to do that? Because it'll make them sad or it'll make them feel bad about genocide. And I always say, do you know who grows up knowing that about Native people? Native kids. So when you're talking about who you're trying to protect, when you're not telling the truth, you are protecting a certain group of children, and for a reason. So tell kids the truth. Don't be afraid to tell them the history, but also don't be afraid to tell them what's at stake right now. They need to know what's at stake.
I'm going to take a couple more questions, and I hope this announcement doesn't make the room empty immediately, but Fernando just came in to let us know that there's free food in Goodwin Forum in Nelson Hall East from some hip-hop thing. I don't know what it is, so feel free to head over when we're done. Okay, questions? All right, we'll go here. Yep.
I don't know quite the right way to phrase the question, but something I've noticed in leftist spaces, in capitalist spaces, and in revolutionary spaces is kind of a lip service to uplifting voices of people of color, of indigenous people, and of women and non-binary folks, without questioning the paradigm of like what's acceptable, what's professional, what's intelligent, and like how we value those things, how our understanding of contribution was based on this like genocidal, capitalist, patriarchal, white supremacist culture. So it's kind of the panel at large, like what have your experiences been like trying to break out of the pattern of like what's acceptable that's kind of determined by the society that's still up, and like what's professional and what's considered intelligent, and like bringing questions of like emotional labor into activist spaces, organizing spaces, questions of like differing models of how we organize ourselves, and differing models of how we prioritize action.
It hasn't been good. Yeah, I mean, there's also the way in which, you know, those values and systems have been internalized by folks who look like us. And some of it is often repeated as, you know, being kind of a part of our culture. You know, like in the community that I'm in Jackson, you know, there's some elements to it which are extremely homophobic, extremely transphobic, and very targeting and abusive. And for trying to create an organization and a space that is not only open, but, you know, grounded in the lives of folks who don't exist in their binary, that comes with some political costs. You know, there are certain groups of folks in our community very explicitly because of that. They just, you know, they just won't fuck with us, just straight up. They just won't. You know, like they may have some respect for some of the things that we do. And I respect the folks who at least tell me to my face that, you know, I don't come to your place because of this, X, Y, and Z. Because at least there's a conversation that could be had rather than just a boycott, you know, which some folks do. So I'm not redirecting the question. I'm just saying that it's what I hear and what you're saying is more complex than just us being quote unquote people of color and having to deal with just the white external world. Like, no, a lot of that colonialized shit is deeply embedded in us now, right? And so there's a two-way front of fighting the larger society, then fighting the expectations around how that's been imposed upon me from how I was brought up, how I was raised, and challenging that thinking and challenging that upbringing. And now that I have children, I see at different points in times me even having to catch myself doing shit that I'm like, wait a minute, what's the logic behind it? Why am I telling that to my kids, or why am I organizing things in that way? A lot of people, I'm not thinking about like this the way it was done, so that's the way it should be, as opposed to like, remember when you were a kid, that didn't make you feel too good. Just like, just do as I say. Don't worry about, who give the orders, just do what I say. Wait a minute, I didn't like that when it happened to me. I'm sure they don't like it when I'm kind of dishing it out to them, right? So there's a lot of layers of this deconstruction that we really kind of have to do. I think the only part, to me, of a part of a conversation that was having earlier that I wish we could have had, more. I don't think I truly expressed what I was trying to say earlier, but I think, I don't expect the world, because of how I have lived it, I don't expect the world to view me as intelligent. I mean, that would be an error on my part to assume that people would view that in me, and I have to be cognizant of that. And there's another side to that battle that I really don't have, at this point in my life, I don't have nothing to prove to nobody, right? There's just what I need to do to organize, to transform the system, and that's beyond just me and my individual intelligence. So I can't get too high on what I've known and what I've tried to focus on, because if it's not translated into a practice and relationship with others, it really doesn't mean anything anyway, right? So there's limits to what our kind of intelligence or being is, and I think we need to kind of accept that and then work within it. Like, how do we constantly reinforce each other to be our best? That's a different type of question, and one I think we need to try to pivot on, at least we're trying to struggle to learn how to pivot around.
I wanted to say, people have asked this question of me before, like, how do you go into these spaces? How do you get invited there? What happens when you are? What are the expectations of you in speaking to people? I say two things that I've learned in my life. One, I say fuck a lot, because I feel like that breaks down people's barriers if I can come in. My original questions that I submitted for this panel were like, what the fuck is going on? What the fuck are we gonna do now, right? Like, I think it's really important to understand that being able to have a conversation where people see that we can actually talk to each other as real people, and it's not sort of like this pseudo-intellectual kind of discussion that we come out saying words like epistemology all the time, and nobody knows what it means. That's not what's going to change the world. But us being able to talk to each other like human beings and tell stories, I think that if you walk away having listened to somebody today, you've done something really important. If you've listened to a person at your table, if you've heard their story, if they've been able to say something, if you've said something, like, everybody has a story to tell. The second thing I'll say is I've stopped not getting, like, my friends tell me you actually can read on my face when I think the question you're asking me is really dumb. I've stopped apologizing for that. And at a point, people will ask me questions, and they'll be like, well, what do you think about? And I'm like, the answer to that is just no. And I don't actually have to explain that to you anymore. There's this thing called the internet. You should go look for that. I'm not here to drag you through this. But I will say that I've done a lot of reading, and what I found is we need to be willing to have all of those emotions with each other, to be angry sometimes, and to be sad sometimes, and to learn from each other in this way that we're, this woman, Adrienne King, does this great work. She says we have to consent to learn in public. To make mistakes, to say things wrong, and then to learn from that, and then say it in a different way. I would have said things totally differently if we did this over again. So I think that I do that, and then I use humor. I think that's an Indian thing, but it's also a people of color, humor. And my grandma always told me, if you can take I would come home and I'd go, Grandma, my life is over. This girl ruined my life. She took my best friend, right, 7th grade. I'm still not over it. And I'd be like, she ruined my life. It's over. That's it. I'm done. She'd go, you know what, Cutcha, this is really going to be a funny story later. And she'd go, and you're going to tell that funny story for the rest of your life, and then you're going to know that it doesn't have power over you. I think we can joke about things because it reminds us that we have the power in that situation, so we can tell our own stories. But I don't think anybody in this room should be afraid if they get invited to a space to speak. And we have to learn to speak and to tell our own story. And Indigenous peoples talk a lot about talking story. We tell through stories because then we can remember who each other are. We can recognize each other later.
Yeah, that's a very complicated question, particularly at this hour, given that most of us up here are on East Coast time. But I just wanted to add, I mean, I definitely agree with both of the other panelists. I just wanted to add, I don't think many times we realize what we're up against. You know, 24/7, that's how often the ruling circles in this country bombard us with propaganda. And that propaganda is filled with all these phobias and all this nonsense about how we deal with each other, you know, and how we look at these concepts of, you know, who's smart and who should we look up to as a leader and who should we follow. You know, they're telling us answers to these questions every day, all the time. And whether we consciously accept them or not, they're being inbred in our minds, you know. And so when we run up some stereotypical situation like going to speak at a predominantly white audience and people look at you like, what are you doing here? You know, you begin to think that maybe some of that propaganda is true. Maybe I'm not as smart as my mama told me I was, you know. But I think that if we understand that we are constantly being told to think that way about each other, whether it's, you know, white supremacy or racism or homophobia or whatever you're more susceptible to because of your upbringing, they're going to figure out what that is and they're going to feed it to you, you know, over and over again. And I go back to the same thing. We have got to work constantly on our consciousness and our understanding of what's going on and how we're being bombarded with that information. Because otherwise, we're all going to fall into it. You know, I have 14 grandchildren, and of the 14, one of my second to the oldest grandchild, William, when he was in high school, he was listening to all of these right-wing radio stations. And he actually began to talk about, you know, how everybody can get rich if you overcome all these negative things that you learn in your history or learn from your relatives. You have to get away from your people if that's what you got to do, and you can become rich too. You know, and so how did that make me feel? You know, here I am, have considered myself a revolutionary for the last 40 years, and my grandson is saying, oh no, I'm going to be a capitalist. You know, I don't know what you're talking about. Well, I could have taken all kinds of different ways to deal with it. What I decided to do was, I'm going to have constant conversation with this young man. We're going to meet on a regular basis, monthly, and we're going to have conversations about what he's talking about, you know, what he's thinking, and we'll see how that goes, you know, because I can't blame him for accepting the 24/7 propaganda that grown folks like me accept, you know, whether I know it or not. And so we just have to realize the environment that we're living in and understand that we've got to fight it every day. You know, we don't get a break. The moment you take a break is the moment you begin to lose a lot faster.
All right, I think due to the late hour, we should wrap up. If there's anybody who's just having a great time and wants to hang out, feel free, but I think we're gonna start closing things down, and I just would encourage you all, if you have unanswered questions, if we've whetted your appetite, if you want more, which I hope you do, please come back tomorrow. We have workshops all day long. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for our wonderful
Dominic, you made it, my friend. Did you make it? What'd you get here? 7, 8? 7? Nice.
All right, man.
My car that check-in came on. You can be around tomorrow. Huh? And like temperature, like roads. And then I started getting down. It's going uphill. Swings. Yeah. So, I mean, it was going through the engine when I was going uphill too. Yeah, when you're going uphill.
The U.S. Solidarity Conference. No.
Well, I mean, I'm going to need to take it out. So we should just start being constructive tomorrow when we talk to each that's why my thought is it might be lower in the world. Cool. So, yes, Karen is staying with us. Dominic is also staying. Dominic, old friend Karen and girlfriend Dominic.
There was a meeting on
I wanted to ask another question.
Go ahead.
But I wonder, I run a very small newspaper about 2 hours out here. And I'm wondering how your relationship is, you guys' relationship with the press in general. Is it useful? Should you have your own media outlet? Parallel to the established press? Very broadly.
We are very keen to tell our
Are you involved in corporate?
this is something that we not prioritize.
Did you do that by starting? You trying to see if you have a newspaper there?
We do a monthly newsletter, that we put online with a mandate for local distribution. The aspiration is to something broader down the road, some type of co-op. There's more in our area,
There's lots of stuff going on.
mainly younger folks, they're more interested in kind of culture production. So that's clearly taking off. Kind of build. So there's kind of like news journalism underneath that. But it's not matching the level. And I think part of it is at least for me, folks are consuming. Folks get their information in different ways, right? So I think that's something. I think in my role within Cooperation Jackson, it's kind of like figuring out what folks want to do and figuring out how to create the resources to make that happen. But I know me personally, I think the media is something that we ultimately have to do.
I have a little background in this. We used to work at a local newspaper out here, and very frustrating in another way. So we try to create our own, make it a co-op newspaper.
share their information. I'm sure Mary. Yeah, I'm sure Mary.
Reaching out to different organizations,
Yeah, 'cause the
organizing,
problem.
you know, I mean, a lot of, yeah, just, oh, yeah. We have a lot of young people. Yeah, yeah.
That'd be great.
Email me. Let me give you my email. And I'll have to do that. Mary's, I don't have it.
Fired up.
Colleague